Good morning, boys and girls. Are you ready for number 20 of Seaman? I sure am. One afternoon, while the explorers were standing at Point Ellis, Seaman stood at the edge of the water and began to bark. The men spotted a dark shape bobbing up, then vanished behind the waves. The shape gradually came nearer, and they could see it was a boat. Indians were rowing out to the stranded explorers. Oh gosh, because remember they were stranded on that little alcove part. They were Clatsop, relatives of the Chinooks. The short, half-naked Indians pulled their canoe onto Point Ellis Beach and unloaded baskets of roots and fish. The captain and seamen gathered around the canoe gratefully. The explorers purchased the Clatsops' food. If the Clatsops could get in and out of Point Ellis during the stormy weather, perhaps some of the stronger men can manage to get out. On November 13th, the captain sent off Coulter, Shannon, and another man in the expedition's Indian canoe. The next day, Seaman ran the rocks and back and forth on the beach, barking excitedly. He scrambled up the rocks and tunneled into a thick underbrush. A few minutes later, he trotted back beside John Coulter. "We found a sandy beach on the bay," Coulter reported. "There's some game over there, too." Everybody was relieved. As soon as they could, the explorers moved to the more comfortable campsite. The captains were hoping to meet a seagoing ship as they neared the coast. Before the expedition started, President Jefferson had given Captain Lewis a letter so the Corps could purchase goods on credit. If the explorers could find a seagoing ship from the United States, they would be able to restock their supplies for their return trip. But the nearer the expedition got to the ocean, the more difficult travel became because of the tides and stormy weather. Instead of taking the whole expedition to the coast, the captains decided to send small scouting parties to search for seagoing vessels. The rest of the Corps camped along the estuary. The scouting parties went up the Pacific coast for several miles. They visited Indian villages along the coast, but none of the local Indians could offer any information about the ships docked in the area. "My guess is we've arrived too late to catch any seagoing vessels," Clark reported after returning from a scouting trip on foot along the coast. "It's November, and the stormy season has certainly started here. Most seagoing ships leave by October." Lewis nodded. "We'd better start building our fort. We can't camp in this miserable rain all winter." And you could go to Fort Clatsop here in Oregon, by Astoria and Seaside. Super cool. The captains discussed the location of their winter fort. They needed a spot with fresh water for drinking, timber for building, and enough game for the food. Local Indians reported that elk were more plentiful south of the Columbia estuary, but perhaps the Corps should make camp along the sea coast in the hope the ship might come by. Then again, the coastal climate was so wet that it might be better to travel back up the Columbia River and build a fort near the Nez Perce and their relatives. That would also give the Corps a head start on their journey home. The captain called the entire group together. Seaman lay between the captain as they spoke. "We're going to take a vote on where to build our winter camp," Lewis announced, looking at each of the explorers. "There's a good reason for each course of action. If we camp close to the sea, we might meet up with a ship from our country and we'd be able to restock our goods. But it's wet and stormy by the coast." As Lewis spoke, Seaman held his head high, watching. Lewis's cheeks were pink from the damp wind and his hair whipped around his face. Some of the explorers held their hand in front of their eyes to protect them from the blowing sand. Sacagawea draped her blanket over her head and shoulders so Pomp would stay warm and dry in his cradle board on her back. "We can also build a winter quarter inland," Clark said. "That will put us under the shelter of the trees. If we build in the woods north of the estuary, the Chinook Indians will be our neighbors. If we choose the south side of the Columbia, we will live near the Clatsop. Both groups are peaceful and eager to trade with us. Seaman felt a tickle on his side and scratched a flea with his paw. He looked at the human explorers. As they listened to the captains, most of them were also scratching their hair or rubbing their tattered clothes against their itchy skin. Seaman chewed at the fur on one of his front legs, trying to bite off another pesky flea. It might be best to head back up the Columbia River and spend the winter near the Nez Perce Nation, Clark was saying. They have our horses, and they've welcomed us with great kindness after we crossed the Rockies. We want everyone in the Corps to have a voice in this decision, Lewis said. Let's talk about the advantages of each location. Every adult in the group was included in the decision, even York and Sacagawea. This was remarkable for 1805. Black men like York were not allowed to vote in the United States elections, nor were Indians or women like Sacagawea. After some discussions and a show of hands, the group voted to build their fort inland on the southern side of the Columbian estuary. On November 6th, the explorers got back into their canoes and paddled south. Lewis took Seaman and a few men to search for a suitable spot. When his group returned, Lewis announced, "We found a place for our Fort William. It's near a spring with a fresh drinking water. There's lots of trees and plenty of game. The men killed 6 elks and 5 deer in that area. It is far from the ocean." Clark asked, "Is it far from the ocean? We should set up an operation to boil seawater so we'll have a supply of salt." "Not far, just a few miles from the coast," Lewis answered. "There's a river near the spot, but the fort will be upon a bluff, so we shouldn't be in danger of flooding." "Sounds good to me," Clark said. He leaned over to stroke the matted fur under Seaman's ears. "You ready to move into the fort so we can get out of the rain, Seaman?" "I know I am." The Corps of Discovery began building Fort Clatsop on December 8th. During construction, it rained almost every day. The men felled trees and stripped branches off the trunks. They pushed the trunks into the soft earth to form the fort's outer walls. Seaman helped the men carry branches and brushes to the edge of the clearing. He dragged the branches in his mouth and made a game of the work by racing the men to the brush piles. Water streamed off the men's faces as they worked, and Seaman's coat dripped. He shook off every few minutes, but nobody shooed him away because everybody was already wet. "Again, the rain," muttered Charbonneau one day. "I think more water falls on Fort Clatsop than fills the whole Pacific Ocean." "We know about the Oregon rain, right?" Shannon grinned. "Cheer up, man. We struggled for a year and a half to reach this place. We'd better make the best of it now that we're finally here." On December 23rd, the captain carried the bedrolls into their unfinished quarters. Seaman padded around the new building, sniffing the fresh pine floors, rough writing tables, and log walls. Lewis unrolled his blanket, and Seaman stretched out beside him. This was going to be their home for the winter. The next day, the men finished covering most of the other buildings inside the Fort Clatsop's walls. They carried their gear into new, dry sleeping quarters. At dawn on December 25th, Seaman scrambled to his feet. Men were gathered outside the captain's hut. They fired a volley shout and sang and announced Christmas Day, 1805. Lewis rolled over and hid his face with his arms, but Seaman tugged at his covers until Lewis hoisted himself up on his elbows. "Merry Christmas, Seaman," Lewis said, laughing. Clark rolled out of his damp sleeping roll and sat up. "Good morning, Merryweather," he shouted to the men outside. "Here we are at Fort Clatsop, men. The Corps of Discovery has reached the Pacific Ocean. Now that's a fine Christmas present." Seaman swabbed Clark's face with his tongue, then dragged the rest of the covers off Lewis. The captains were much too slow-moving this morning, so Seaman ran out and opened the doorway to join the carolers. The group feasted on good wishes. There wasn't much else. It was a holiday for hunters as well as builders, and in a damp climate, meat and fish went rotten quickly. So the menu for Christmas dinner was spoiled elk meat, rotting fish, and a few soggy roots. Yuck. The men and the fish smelled so bad that the men had to force themselves to put their food in their mouths. Seaman was not fussy like humans. He was the only member of the Corps who ate with an appetite. After Christmas Day, the men completed their work on the smokehouse to dry and preserve their meat. Fort Clatsop was finished in time for New Year's. January 1st, 1806 was damp and drizzly. The explorers hardly celebrated the New Year Day at all, but at least the fort was finished, so they had dry wood floors to sleep on and a roof to keep the constant rain off of them. As soon as the explorers moved into their new quarters, so did the fleas. Even cheerful Shannon grumbled about the pests. These tiny little varmints are more troublesome than mosquitoes, ticks, and gnats combined, he complained. It's bad enough to eat me. They're going to eat me alive. Why do they have to wake me up at night to devour me? I think I slept better on prickly pears back at Great Falls. It doesn't seem to freeze out here in the winter, so the fleas don't get killed off, Walter said. You just have to ignore them, Shannon, or you'll scratch your skin raw like poor Seaman is doing. The men looked at Seaman, who was scratching his side with his hind leg. The dog jumped up and plopped right back down to scratch the other side. Day after day he scratched. He rolled onto his back and slid along the rough boards to scratch his itchy skin. He dug through his fur with his snout, trying to bite off the itchy little creatures. Sometimes he chewed off clumps of hair, exposing raw patches of skin. Oof. Sacagawea rubbed grease on the sores, but Seaman licked off the grease and chewed more fur. The winter weather at Fort Clatsop was either damp or drab or wet or gusty. Although it was never very cold, it was always never very sunny. Between early December and late March, the explorers counted only 6 days of fair weather and only 12 days without rain. Most days, the hunters went out in search of game. They returned with damp clothes and wet moccasins. Seaman's coat got soaked when he went hunting with the men because the ground was always soggy and the trees dripped. Usually the hunters brought back elk, so most of the meals at Fort Clatsop were elk, boiled elk, dried elk, jerked elk, sometimes spoiled elk. In 3 months, the explorers consumed 131 elk. When the men returned from hunting, they hurried to smoke any extra game before it started to spoil. As winter wore on, the hunters killed all the game in the nearby countryside. The captain had to trade with the Clatsop Indians for fish, roots, dog meat to add to their food supply. When the men weren't hunting, they spent their days inside damp forts scraping elk hides, sewing moccasins for their return trip, and stoking the smokehouse fire. For outdoors men, this was a boring task. The gloomy skies made everybody feel gloomy. Even Seaman paddled through the fort with a droopy tail. The men complained of colds, flu, and muscle strain. Much of the captain's time at Fort Clatsop was taken up with their writing. They sat on rough benches bent over crude desks and wrote by candlelight. Seamen stretched out on the floor in the captain's quarters and watched them dip their quill pens into bottles of ink and scratch them across pages and pages. Lewis described plants, animals, and Indians. Clark made a careful map of the lands that they had traveled through. He estimated that they had covered over 4,000 miles from the mouth of the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. His estimate was based on his daily count of miles by dead reckoning, by comparing the distance from one point to the next based on a similar but known distance. Could you imagine? Have you noticed how well the Indians' hats shed water? Lewis said to Clark one day as they sat in their quarters writing. He was describing the hats in his notes. They're so tightly woven that water rolls off the cedar bark. I'd like to have one of those hats. Clark laughed. Watch out. It'll probably cost you more than you want to spend. The Clatsops do charge awfully steep prices, Lewis said, shaking his head. They always get the better deal in a trade. But at least they're honest, Clark said. When the Chinooks came to our camp to trade, they were always stealing things. I haven't heard of any men complaining about Clatsop stealing from our fort. The Clatsops have some admirable qualities. They know how to make wonderful canoes, Lewis continued, reflecting aloud about this tribe. Of all the Indians we've met, they seem the most peaceful. Their young men don't show any interest in fighting among themselves or with neighboring tribes. But some of their customs puzzle me, Meriwether. Lewis nodded. You're thinking about the way they flatten their babies' heads by keeping them between boards. That's a little weird. Yes, Clark answered. It puzzles me that Clatsops would consider a flattened head more beautiful. It also puzzles me that they admire stout legs on their women, so much so that they tie cords around their women's ankles to cause their legs to swell. Lewis grinned mischievously. I take it you're planning to show your lady friend, Miss Julia, how to thicken her legs by binding her ankles, Lewis teased, when we get back in the United States. Well, that's an interesting thing to say. As soon as Lewis mentioned the name of the young woman, Clark's face turned as red as his hair. To hide his embarrassment, Clark quickly dipped his pen into the bottle of ink and stood over the map he was drawing. Seaman heard the playful tone in Lewis's voice and scrambled to his feet. He padded over to Lewis, a pine cone in his mouth and his tail wagging hopefully. All right, Seaman, Lewis said, taking the pine cone. Let's go outside for a while. I think William might prefer to be alone. He cleared his throat. Alone with the map of his heart. Okay, we're going to stop right there. So you can visit Fort Clatsop. Hopefully it's open this summer. It's, like I said, on the Oregon coast. I went with my family last year. It was pretty cool. Anyway, hope you all have a good day. Enjoy part 20. And you enjoyed part 20. I'll see you guys tomorrow.